Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Gillis. I'm the General Manager for Networking and Security Products here at VMware. And I'm joined with Dr. Chris Kruegel.
Hi, I'm Chris Kruegel. I'm VP Security Services at VMware and also faculty at UC Santa Barbara and the co-founder of Lastline.
Yeah, and Chris won't tell you this, but I always like to. He's probably one of the most published threat researchers in the world. So we're going to talk today about some really interesting trends in security, which is we have to make the assumption that no matter how good your perimeter, somehow, some way, somebody's going to find a way in. And so what we can talk about are what are the controls we can put in place to stop them once they've gotten in. So let's dive into it. I think we all know that no matter what you do at the perimeter, there's going to be some way that an attacker can get a foothold. Right? There's very, very high profile examples like the SolarWinds breach, where you have an incredibly powerfully engineered solution that took years for the adversary to develop. But then you also have, much less exotic breaches, like at a high-profile credit rating agency, where you had a single instance of an Apache server that just wasn't updated. And it wasn't because someone made a mistake. It's because they had an incompatibility with that flavor of Apache struts and the version of Linux that they were running. And so however it is the attackers get their foothold, we make the assumption that they're going to land in your data center. And that's not where the damage is done. But at this credit rating agency, what we saw was that those attackers made 48 lateral movements over the course of 9 months. And this is where the damage is done. And so it's for this reason that we believe east-west is the new north-south. What does that mean? It means that east-west internal controls in the data center are actually far more relevant, far more effective than just a strong perimeter by itself. And this is an underlying principle of the zero trust architecture. So if these are so important, why is it that so many companies today have relatively simple or no east-west controls? I was talking to a customer just this morning who said, pretty much once you're in the data center, it's any connectivity. Anybody can talk to anybody. Well, the reason is because traditional network security devices like a firewall were designed for perimeter. And a perimeter was a thing you could touch. It's a place you could insert an appliance. And so when we think about east-west traffic, in this picture that we're showing you, all those servers on the left, they're doing the job of actually running an application. And the communication between them would have to hairpin in and out of the servers into this firewall that has no context for what that traffic really looks like, and therefore is very ineffective at making east-west policy decisions. So imagine if we could take that software, that firewall, and the IDS IPS that goes along with it, define it in software, and break it literally into 10,000 pieces. 10,000 little baby firewall, IDS, IPS, security analytics modules, and then attach each one of those modules to each one of the services that make up your application. This is the power of virtualization. It allows us to use a distributed architecture. I'm not talking about just making a VM of a traditional firewall. I'm talking about taking a firewall and running it across thousands of pieces in the virtualization layer and having it behave and be managed like one logical firewall. When we do this, it allows us to really think differently about how we secure east-west traffic in the data center. Now, we're not subject to just firewalls. All of your infrastructure in a cloud-like architecture can be defined in software and distributed across general-purpose x86 servers. So load balancing, GSLB, WAF, even network analytics, where you used to tap traffic and bring it to some giant data lake. Well, imagine in a virtualized world, if we turn that model upside down, instead of moving the traffic to the analytics, what if we could move the analytics to the traffic? And this is what Chris and I are going to talk about today, the power of virtualization to implement distributed security in your data center and protect your east-west traffic. We've done this ourselves at VMware, and we ran an internal audit of what does the traffic look like? And it is amazing what you can find. Just looking at existing traffic flows, we're able to identify clearly anomalous traffic flows and behaviors that indicate compromise and attack activity taking place. And we've done this now across hundreds of enterprise companies. We almost always find something. So the assumption that there's no one in your network, that's a dated assumption, right? We can show you a picture to show here's activity that is probably leading to something bad. And then here are steps that we can take for how we're going to stop that. Now, the way we do this was there's three legs of the stool. On the way in, we think about web app firewall, and this is a mature technology that's been around forever, and yet we still see breaches that are tied to the OAuth top 10. So making sure that you're running a software-based web app firewall that's going to be able to process all of your traffic all of the time is essential. The second thing is the east-west firewalls that I was talking about in a distributed architecture. And then lastly, having workload security that is purpose-built for server. Running a Windows AV system on your Linux server in the data center is really not going to do you a lot of good. And so having a purpose-built solution in the endpoint, these are the three pillars of a world-class data center security solution. And we'll talk about how these things can work together to really help identify all types of attacks. And so what we're going to focus on this conversation is the network aspects. What can we do in the network to help bring this to life? So we really see three steps for world-class security. The first and most foundational is segmentation. I like to say that segmentation is like locking your door when you leave the house. If you don't do it and someone breaks in, you invited them in. So segmentation can be as simple as, let's separate my development environment from my production environment, but we can also move it into tighter and tighter circles around individual segments per application. And segmentation stops the obviously bad traffic. I don't need machine learning or complicated heuristics to know that a production environment should never connect to a database in a development environment ever under any circumstances. So I want to stop that from happening. The second is a little more sophisticated, which is let's look at in-band traffic. Let's look at traffic that would appear normal to the network. It's HTTP, it's flowing from a web server into an app server. And let's identify compromised machines and malicious activity within what would otherwise appear to be a normal flow. And we can do this very effectively with a distributed signature-based system around IDS and IPS. And now the third step is to be able to go beyond signatures and say, let's look at each one of these steps along the way. Let's look at each one of the elements that make up my application and identify anomalous traffic. And Chris is going to talk specifically about what we're doing in that domain. So Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Let me drill a little bit deeper into that third step, that behavior-based network detection and response. And I think the first question that we should ask ourselves, why do we really need it? What is it that it brings to the table that segmentation and IDS, IPS cannot deliver on its own? And I think the answer is the ability to detect zero-day threats, previously unknown threats that are spreading in your network. So you might have used segmentation to reduce your attack surface. That is great. You're using IDS, IPS to look for signs of previously known, previously seen attacks. And that is absolutely necessary. But there's always this question of what do you do when an attacker uses a piece of malware, a threat, an exploit that nobody has seen before. And this is where behavior-based detection is the answer. And the question, of course, is, well, how does it work? And I think there are two parts or two steps that I want to point out, and then I will dive into much more detail in this presentation. One is we want to detect individual suspicious activity, individual anomalies, individual cases where, for example, there's a connection between a VM and service A or between an application and the file server. And we need to be able, and we want to be able to detect that. And then we want to take all these activities, all these suspicious events that we detect within the network, and we want to put them together to zoom out, put the dots together and tell you the bigger picture. The key really is sort of finding the individual suspicious activities and then putting them together to tell you the bigger picture of what's happening in the network to deliver effective network detection response. And of course, now the question becomes, how can we detect these individual behaviors when we have not seen anything bad before? And this question is going back to the name behavior-based, right? We cannot look at specific instances of an attack. We cannot look at how something looks like, how a file looks like, or if it connects to a particular known domain or a particular known IP address. We really have to look for patterns that are somehow indicative of unwanted suspicious behavior in the network. And this is exactly where AI will help us, right? This is where machine learning and AI can be a useful tool, like automating or mimicking a human that looks at data that is presented and trying to find patterns in that data and trying to make sense out of the data. That's exactly what we want from behavior-based detection as well, right? We want basically that the machine sifts through that huge amount of data and looks for patterns that are indicative of suspicious behaviors, right? And so the question really here is, okay, is AI, is ML just giving us that capability for free? Is it the silver bullet that we all have looked for? And the answer is no. We have to be very careful. We have to use AI, we have to use machine learning the right way. And the 3 V's of big data are a very well-known concept, and the V's stand for volume, variety, and velocity. And what it tells us is, in order to use AI, in order to use machine learning properly, we have to have the right data. And we have to have enough of the right data. That's really what volume and variety stands for. And if you don't have the right data, then you don't see the threats in the data. You don't have the right signals to detect it. And neither AI nor a human could be able to detect something. So we need to have the right data, and we need to have a lot of that right data to be able to properly train our machine learning systems, so they can then go back and recognize indicators of suspicious activity, patterns of these suspicious behaviors in the data. And of course, this has to be done fast enough. So we have to make sure that we pick the right algorithms that are able to detect those threats in the data fast enough.
So Chris, let me ask you a question. When I look at some of these very high profile attacks, the anomalies are so anomalous. Like, there's such huge deviations from the norm that it seems like it would be easy to detect them. Is it hard for a machine to identify this?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? It really depends on the type of suspicious activity that you're looking for. In some cases, it's really easy. Think of a port scan. If you have an infected machine that suddenly connects to hundreds of other assets in your network, it has never done that before. It's very noisy, it's very easy to detect, and you don't need really very sophisticated machine learning or AI at all to detect this. But there are also certain threats that are much subtler, right? Maybe it's just one connection that uses a protocol that is usual for that machine, but maybe the identifier is slightly different, or maybe the timing is slightly off, or maybe taken together with another couple of signals, only in its entirety does it actually look suspicious. And I think that is a very important distinction, because a lot of companies say, yes, we use AI, we use machine learning, and that might even be true, but the question really is, what types of machine learning AI do you bring to the table? And what is the data that you have to train these systems? So you cannot just pick the obvious sore thumbs that everybody can find, but you can really recognize the subtle attacks that can be much more dangerous and much more important to find.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, right? So this is where I think it's important to dig a little bit deeper and talk about, okay, so how does AI-based detection of malicious network behaviors work normally, right? A lot of systems are basically implementing what we have here as the first step on the left. They're looking at all the network traffic. They're using some type of unsupervised machine learning model. That means we're using some algorithm to find a baseline. So what's normal in my network? What appears commonly in this network? And then they try to look for the outliers, right? This anomalous activity that might stick out. And that can detect certain things like that port scan that we have mentioned, but it is not enough, right? Because there are a couple of reasons. One is certain anomalous activity is just not bad at all, right? So maybe we have found some outlier, something that looks like a sore thumb. And is that a problem? Well, could be, could not be, right? We don't know, right? We need to do more to understand if that anomaly is actually a problem or not. And of course, certain attacks don't show up as anomalies at all, right? So there are these two problems. And so we always encourage everyone who is sort of talking to vendors who offer network security products and tout the use of machine learning, as is very common, to take that extra step and try to understand, are you just using unsupervised machine learning, or are you doing more? And if you just use unsupervised machine learning, how do you distinguish between benign anomalies and truly malicious anomalies? And this is where our second piece, that supervised machine learning, threat-centric machine learning comes in. That is very important, because supervised machine learning allows you to do classifications. It allows you to tell a dog from a cat, right? But it also allows you to distinguish between a bad anomaly and maybe something that is abnormal but not worth worrying about, right? And that is really crucial to be able to distinguish between true threats and anomalies that are just false positives, things that we don't have to worry about, even though they might violate the baseline. And so it's important that you have both supervised and unsupervised machine learning capabilities to truly find threats that matter. But then the question becomes, okay, so I want to use supervised machine learning. That's great. How do I train it, right? In a supervised machine learning algorithm, you have to, well, supervise the learning process. That means you have to present the system examples of what you want to find as okay and what you want to classify as malicious. And here I want to point out that the quality and especially the volume of training data is extremely important. This graph is taken from a paper from 20 years where folks at Microsoft looked at the detection accuracy of natural language algorithms, natural language models. And what they've basically shown is if you look at the x-axis that shows the millions of words of training data versus the y-axis that shows the accuracy of these models, you can see that the more training data, the more millions of words you present to these 4 algorithms that are shown here in these different colored lines, all algorithms are just getting better with more training data. And the quality of individual algorithms in the end doesn't matter that much, right? The worst algorithm might be the best in the end if you just give it a lot of training data. But the key is all of them get better as training data increases, the volume of training data. And when we look in the context of security, network security, it becomes extremely important that you are able to present a lot of threats to your machine learning system so it can learn, pick up those patterns, right? And for that is really crucial that you have automated systems that can analyze threats and malware, for example, in a high quality sandbox, as we have, where it's really possible to classify millions and millions of threats every day and use the data you derive from these analysis runs to then build and train machine learning systems that are able to look for similar patterns, related suspicious activity in the network. So it's the right selection of algorithms, supervised and unsupervised learning, and the right amount of high quality data to train those supervised learning algorithms. And that brings us to the question, okay, so what can these NDR, these network detection response detections do? Well, we expect and we want that AI-based detections work across the entire cyber kill chain, right? And that goes from the initial compromise and initial connections that a malware or a threat might make once they have compromised the first asset, over the lateral movement step where they move around in the network to command and control and eventual data exfiltration. And I've just shown a few examples here, right? So you can look at beaconing activity where you don't know that this is an infected machine that tries to locate its command and control server, but you see some repeated check-in patterns, and maybe they are combined with some abnormal, suspicious DNS activity. So that would be, for example, in the case of the DGN, a domain name generation algorithm. And then you're looking at, okay, so what happens if the attackers try to move laterally? Are they using different protocols? Are they moving to different assets? Are they using different identifiers? And do they try to connect using different HTTP connections where the headers look unusual and suspicious? To the case where you can just upload a file, or you might want to be a bit more stealthy and you try to hide the content that you want to exfiltrate, leak from the organization, again in DNS, and use it as a covert channel, right? And in all these cases, there are signals that supervised machine learning algorithms and unsupervised machine learning algorithms can successfully pick up and allow you to detect threats, even if we have never seen them before.
Chris, one of the most high profile and talked about breaches, certainly of the year and perhaps the decade, was the SolarWinds breach. How would this approach of looking across the whole kill chain, how would that help in that type of a very sophisticated attack?
Yeah, it really would help across the entire kill chain because we assume nobody has any indicators of that particular malware. As you said, it has been written from scratch. A lot of effort has gone into it. It used a new infrastructure that we didn't know before. But you still would pick up some of these signs. For example, right, the check-in, the DNS-based check-ins, where you might see some strange use of DNS names to encode even some information about the environment where the infection has taken place. And so from the earliest stages of the DNS-based check-in and beaconing to obviously when you, for example, the attackers use that backdoor to run scripts that move around in a network, right? You have this box that is used to control your network, and suddenly it's creating all these connections that it has never done before. And why is your network monitoring system connecting to all these places in the network, to eventually when data is being leaked out, right? Depending on the mechanism that the attackers would use eventually, there's a good chance that AI-based detectors have a shot at detecting that. So I think across all stages of this breach, there were signals that we would expect NDR detectors to properly pick up. And of course, if you don't have those, or if you just rely on more traditional techniques, there's a chance that you miss it. And then, those attacks might stay in the network for quite some time. So definitely a very important tool in the arsenal of everybody who, is dealing with threats like as you mentioned, the sunburst vector. All right, so the first step is finding those individual suspicious activity. But as I said before, there's a second step. It's not only about those individual events, it's about the bigger picture, something that we refer to as intrusions, others call it campaigns. The question is, you have to comb through these massive amounts of things that happen in large networks. You might have your IDS IPS hit, the firewall might block some connection. We find a malicious file in our sandbox. We have some NTA detections where the NDR system detects some suspicious activity. And what we really want is filter out the noise or put different events together to tell the larger story. And it's really a first step tries to look at identity, or tries to identify relevant threat activity. And again, machine learning can help you to identify maybe certain patterns that a number of events together are typically associated with benign behavior, or you have a number of events that taken together are implementing a particular attacker behavior, right? So you want to first filter, and this often yields an order or even 2 of magnitude of reduction in the individual events that security analysts have to look at. And when you then have hundreds of these security relevant events, you want to put them together and you want to do temporal and spatial correlation, where you're basically saying things that belong together, that happen on the same host, or that happen on multiple hosts that are connected by network connections. And you want to lay out that kill chain, and you want to overlay those events on top of the kill chain. And again, this gives you a significant reduction in the things that analysts have to look at. And it adds also a lot of context that really makes it easier to understand if that entity, that intrusion, is something that you should worry about or not, right? So that's what NDR gives you. It finds all these signs of suspicious activity, and it combines, puts that together and elevates it to a small number of important, relevant intrusions. And again, this is something that whenever you are looking into NDR solutions for your data center, it's questions that you should ask yourself. How much data will my analysts have to look at? How likely is it that I have to sift through anomalies versus true suspicious or threat behavior? How much context do I have for maybe previously unknown threats? So we find it's very important to implement both powerful machine learning driven detection, and then the correlation and contextualization of these individual events into big pictures. So that's why I'm super excited about NDR, and why I think it's an important part in the arsenal of everyone who is looking to secure the data center. But of course, one question that always comes up, and I've also spoken to many customers that then ask me this question: what do you do with encrypted traffic, right? Because you're saying you have an IDS IPS, you want to use NTA capabilities to look maybe into HTTP traffic, DNS traffic. What happens if that is encrypted, right? You can't see anything, so are we missing all these threats? I think it's important to know that there's a lot that can be done from the network. And here we have listed 3 capabilities that we find are crucial to address the problem of encrypted traffic. The first 2, we go into a little more detail. One is encrypted traffic analysis. Basically, it means, well, why don't we just analyze the encrypted traffic itself? Why don't we try to extract signal from what is encrypted traffic without looking at payload? And there's a lot that we can do with machine learning. The second part is, well, what if we don't even have to take information out of this encrypted connection, and we're able to basically wait at the end of that encrypted pipe and pull the relevant information out when it is already decrypted? And that's very powerful and really relies on that distributed architecture, Tom, that you've mentioned before. And the third point is TLS decryption, and that is, I think, the most well-known and most well-understood one, is where you basically perform a man in the middle against the connection between two endpoints, and you're basically breaking the traffic open, and you're saying, well, I'm just looking at the plain text anyway, so no big deal. And so obviously, each of these has advantages and different capabilities. We recommend all three of them to use together. And let me just talk a little bit about the first and the second one. The first one is encrypted traffic analysis. So don't break open the traffic. You're sort of taking this pipe that is encrypted, and you're sort of listening and try to see, can I understand what's going on inside this pipe by just sort of listening to what signals I can still get. And so what are those signals? Well, you can look at some routing information, IP addresses, DNS names, very easy. But you can also look at the length and the number of packets. You can look at timing. You can look at information that was used to set up cryptography or cryptographic protection, like keys or certificates. And all this metadata is something that you see despite the actual payload being encrypted. And again, you can use machine learning, supervised machine learning models that can train on this metadata so they can later recognize, hey, this is a particular connection that I recognize as being bad because it looks very, very similar to threats that I've previously seen in my training data. So that helps you even when no encryption is happening. When you cannot decrypt the traffic, so when there's no decryption happening. Okay, and the second part is now that file analysis, where we are basically saying, okay, let's say the content, for example, a piece of malware is transmitted over an encrypted connection, and we can't look into it, we cannot break it open. But what happens at the endpoint? What happens when the file is actually received, for example, here by a VM, a process inside the VM, for example, a server, a service, maybe even a browser, and then it's written to disk. And why don't we just sort of, before it's being actually, in its unencrypted form written to disk, can we sort of can we reach into the VM and pull it out? And then we put it into the analysis pipeline that uses static and maybe dynamic analysis. And that's something that the distributed firewall, the architecture uniquely allows us, because given that we have a position in the hypervisor, and this is a mechanism called guest introspection that can leverage VM tools to really reach into the VM, pull and access the decrypted file, and then send it into the malware analysis pipeline, right? And that can be as simple as a quick hash lookup, and the file is bad, and you can quarantine it, to some more sophisticated static analysis. Could be an EV scan, could be AI models that look at properties of the file, to a full-blown static dynamic analysis in the sandbox, where we basically take the file and we run it in an instrumented environment to understand if it's doing anything that is considered suspicious. And so that is, in some sense, three different ways in which we can deal with encrypted traffic to provide the very valuable vantage point that network security provides to you.
Chris, the ability to reach into the host and extract payloads without having to go through the heavy lift of breaking, decrypting all your TLS traffic seems really elegant to me. In your viewpoint, how effective is it? What kind of coverage does this give us?
I think it's, in some sense, when you look at those three techniques, it's the one that has the broadest or most complete coverage. Because if you look at TLS decryption, it really just works for TLS traffic, right? It is already in the name. If we're able to man in the middle an HTTPS connection, SSL or TLS, then yes, you have the chance to inspect the content of that traffic. But there is no need that the attackers, or there's no necessity for the attackers to necessarily use TLS, right? Yes, it's very common to see TLS encrypted connections, both on the internet and in the data center, but attackers could use SSH to encrypt files, or even custom encryption protocols. And in this case, TLS decryption would not help at all, right? While when we're looking here at guest introspection, we see all the files regardless of where they came from. So it's really a very powerful mechanism to leverage VM tools and basically pull the files in regardless of where they came from, and then sort of it's by definition more complete than just TLS decryption. That's why we're super excited about it. Okay, so that hopefully gives you also some idea of the often often raised concern of encryption, and really hopefully shows you that these 3 steps make sense that Tom has outlined. And with that, I'm giving it back to you, Tom, to sort of summarize those defense in-depth steps in the data center.
Awesome. So, layers of the cake, right? We start with the basic building block of making sure that we're putting segmentation in it, cut it up into pieces, make those pieces smaller and smaller, make it harder for the attackers to move through. Second step is doing in-band analysis using that distributed signature and layer 7 firewall, right? It's being able to identify friend from foe within a given traffic flow. And then, as Chris talked about, the very powerful network traffic analysis where you don't have to worry about tapping, you don't have to be bound by encrypted traffic. That, to me, is really state of the art. Now, the other end of the wire in the data center is the endpoint. And modern EDR solutions that are built for a server have gone way beyond what a traditional endpoint used to do. So it's not just antivirus anymore, but we're taking all of the functions that were necessary in the endpoint and delivering them with a cloud backend. So the goal here is a lightweight sensor, a sensor that can be inserted from the hypervisor. As we said, Chris talked about like the ability to reach up into the host and transparently do things. We can do that with the EDR solution that reaches in and makes it effectively agentless. And yet it provides this rich set of integrated functionality. And so the name of the game here is simplifying operations, removing those cumbersome and heavy agents and allowing your servers to be deployed automatically. Now, when we have this presence in the endpoint and we have this understanding on the network, you got a chocolate meets peanut butter situation, a really powerful combination, because that sensor is aware of all of the processes that are running in the server. So let's imagine we have an Apache server talking to an app server, okay? We know what Apache looks like. We know what the processes we should expect in Apache. Now, there may be a new process that launches, and that doesn't mean it's bad, but it's certainly suspicious, right? I call it process X, because X is always, very, very suspect. And so we have the ability to pass this process reputation information into the network analysis system. And so we can actually look on a flow-by-flow basis and say, we know here's a process that we know to be part of Apache and good, connecting to another process that we know to be part of the app server, and it's asking for things that we expect to see on the wire. But when that process X asks the app server for, can I please have 250 million credit card numbers, do you think that's a transaction we should allow? It's almost like common sense, but bringing together the context of the endpoint and the network, this is what the industry is calling XDR. And I think it's the most powerful thing that we as a team are working on. It's incredibly powerful because it's going to be able to allow us to identify those anomalies that Chris was talking about with broad contextual understanding and the huge amount of data that's necessary in a machine learning and AI powered solution. And so really, as we think about world-class east-west security in the data center, there's a fourth step, which is the segmentation. It's to go with the signature-based IDS IPS, the anomaly detection, and as XDR solutions really become a reality, I think XDR is the new frontier for how I can make sure that my data center assets are secure. Now, none of this stuff really matters if you can't use it. Does anybody recognize this picture? The VCR with the flashing light, and you're like trying to set the clock on that thing. You ever actually try to set the clock on a VCR? Like, this is an age test, but like I did, and it was unbelievably complicated, right? And so our view is, how do we take these powerful security capabilities and make them easy? And again, this is where the power of virtualization comes in. You just simply can't do this in a physical world. Imagine being able to connect all of those security services to each one of the pieces of your application. And as that application flexes and moves, you spin up a new VM, the firewall, the IPS, the network traffic analysis, there's no taps involved. All of those rules are automatically applied. You vMotion an app server from one machine to another, guess what? The firewall, the IPS, the NTA all moves with it. So having this stuff be built in allows our customers to operationalize it and operationalize it at scale. This is something that you can't do without virtualization. But in a virtualized world, whatever type of cloud you're running on, virtualization is the foundation that allows us to deliver world-class security in a highly efficient, highly automated fashion and really enable that defense in depth for the data center. So taken together, we've talked about a complete series of steps that we can use to enable defense in depth in the data center and really protect your east-west and your internal flows, as well as you've protected your perimeter. It starts with segmentation, cutting it up into chunks. The second thing we want to do is we want to add distributed layer 7 aware signature analysis to identify stolen credentials, compromised machines, flows that shouldn't be happening but look like they're okay. And then, as Chris really elaborated, the power of machine learning to identify anomalous traffic within the network without having to use taps is very, very effective, very powerful. And the new frontier for us is to combine both host context analysis and network context analysis together into an XDR solution. And that's really the state of the art in east-west controls. We will stay on the line and continue to answer questions. Thanks, everyone, for your time, and we enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.